So last month there was a considerable amount of attention centered around the death of the last male northern white rhino named Sudan. At 45 years old, Sudan suffered from an age-related infection and he was euthanized on March 19th, as per Smithsonian.com. Sudan lived at the Ol Pejeta Conservancy in Kenya, which is the largest black rhino sanctuary in East Africa and puts forth great effort into conservation of wildlife. Today's episode of the Ask a Scientist podcast focuses on conservation. What is it and why is it important? Here to help answer these questions is Xingli Giam.
Hi there. So my name is Xingli Giam and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UT. My research focuses on characterizing and mitigating anthropogenic impacts on the environment with a particular emphasis on freshwater and stream ecosystems. So right now our group's project ranges from looking at climate change impacts on fishes in the southern Appalachians to looking at coal mining impacts in Southeast Asia.
Oh, nice. That sounds really interesting. All right, so let's just go ahead and dive right into the questions. So can you tell us a little bit about the concept of conservation? So what exactly is conservation?
Basically, conservation in short, it means ensuring the persistence of the different species of animals, plants, fungi, and microbes, and these are collectively known as biodiversity, living on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how is that implemented?
Conservation might entail a combination of protecting the habitats these animals are known to occur in or live in. It might involve actively restoring this habitat. It might involve curtailing direct threats such as hunting, bushmeat consumption, overfishing, mining, pollution, and climate change. It also involves monitoring wild populations to see how well they are doing. And in some cases, ex situ breeding programs and reintroductions of species are necessary.
Okay. So to me, at least, it seems really obvious to protect species that have a blatant need to survive. Such as bumblebees, because they are in charge of pollinating flowers and all that sort of stuff. So in terms of conservation, why is this something that we should pay attention to for other animals that might not exactly have a very obvious need, like bumblebees?
So I think we need to pay attention to all species, including species that do not, or species that do not confer any benefits to humans, or there are some species out there that actually do confer some non-trivial benefit, but we don't currently know of the benefit that it confers. Mm-hmm. So my PhD advisor at Princeton University coined this term, and it's called the night parrot effect. Mm-hmm. So the night parrot is one of Australia's rarest birds, and it was thought to be extinct from the wild in Australia, but was recently rediscovered again. So the thing is that this species is one of those species that would not have any discernible benefits for humans. Mm-hmm. It's not a species that bird watchers would want to pay money to watch.
Yeah.
So it's really important to understand that we should not conserve species just because of their benefits to humans, but it's also our moral imperative to conserve all species. And we also do not know what benefits this species might have to humans in the future. Mm-hmm. And ecologically, we know that ecosystems are really, really complex with many ecological linkages between different organisms or species. And it's really difficult to tell how important ecosystem functions like nutrient recycling or climate regulation might be compromised when mm-hmm. one or more species are lost from a particular area. And this is why, for precautionary purposes, we should really aim to not lose any species, because we are not sure of what kind of ecological cascades could occur or could result from losing species.
Right. Okay. That makes a little bit of sense. So going more into that, what are some of the reasons that species can become endangered or go extinct?
So one of the most important reasons is really habitat loss, mm-hmm. and this occurs through land cover and land use change, and more specifically deforestation, mm-hmm. in the tropics especially, because we know that the tropics harbor most or the majority of the Earth's species. So high deforestation rates in the tropics in recent years have really resulted in the loss of many populations of species. So deforestation is a process where land that's originally covered by natural forests are being replaced by other different types of land covers or land users, such as oil palm plantations in tropical Asia, pastures and soybean cropland in South America, or various types of agriculture or mining land in the US. So all of this amounts to a loss of habitat for organisms, and because they lose their natural habitat, they may not be able to survive in this habitat, the new habitat anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. And also, like closer to home in the southern Appalachians, we know that freshwater mussels have gone extinct, and many of them are currently being severely endangered or threatened, likely owing to the loss of their preferred habitat, which is like fast-flowing shallow rivers due to the installation of dams. So habitat loss affects both terrestrial species and freshwater species. And there are many other reasons as well, such as the direct human exploitation of animals, like large animals are being poached, and these large animals include tigers, rhinos, and some bears are being poached for their body parts. And then there are certain animals, such as slow lorises, sloths, and tropical birds. They are all being trapped for the pet trade. And then there are other factors such as invasive species, like species that are not originally occurring in a particular region that are then being introduced, and they may affect the native species that are occurring in the area. And one example is of the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an insect introduced from East Asia that is currently threatening hemlocks in the eastern US by disrupting the flow of nutrients from the roots up to the canopy. And last of all, one of the most important threats that are likely to affect biodiversity in the coming years would, I guess, be climate change, and the impacts of climate change will only intensify in the future. And all of these stresses, they kind of stem from our humans' demand for food, energy, and water that's causing these changes in the environment.
Yeah, so it's not just one factor; it's just a bunch of different things that could contribute to that.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, the Smithsonian actually touched on how modern technology could be used to help reintroduce species into the wild. I think, like you mentioned, a reintroduction of species could be part of like conservation efforts. So they mentioned things from in vitro fertilization to things like cloning. So would reintroducing the northern white rhino population, you think, be beneficial for the ecosystem as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I guess we wouldn't know what the impact would be until we do it, and until then we can only speculate what it would mean for the ecosystem. And as mentioned in the article, we are pretty far from being able to employ many of these assisted reproduction strategies suggested in the article, right? So they suggested things like the artificial insemination of the 2 remaining female northern white rhinos, or fertilizing frozen eggs with sperm stored in cryogenic collections like that of the San Diego Zoo, and implanting them into a southern white rhino surrogate mother.
Yeah.
Or the third thing that they suggested was perhaps hybridizing the northern white rhino with a male southern white rhino.
Right.
So all these things were the stuff that they suggested. I think it might be safe to introduce a northern white rhino if we kind of succeed in the first method, which is the artificial insemination of the one or two of the remaining female northern white rhinos. As for the strategy of hybridizing, I'm not quite sure, or I'll be a little bit cautious of that. First, it might be really expensive.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I think we are still very far away from being able to do that, so that would require a lot of funding from different places, like from private donors or from governments. And the resulting hybrid rhino would be different from the original northern white rhino anyway, that we want to recover. So given its high costs, would conservation monies be better spent protecting the southern white rhino population? Because we know that currently there are about 20,000 southern white rhinos that are still in the original habitat, and this population of southern white rhinos are actually under threat from poaching as well. So, money might be better spent on this population as well as other species of animals that are kind of on the brink of extinction, rather than spending it figuring out how we can hybridize northern white rhino with the southern white rhino.
Oh, okay.
But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah. As I think I do agree with you. I feel like we don't really know exactly what to expect if we do reintroduce the animal population for the northern white rhinos, because this was just very recent, so we haven't really had a lot of time to see what kind of effect that would have on the ecosystem, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, totally. There's no way to find out until we do it. I think that if the original northern white rhino phenotype can be introduced back into the environment, there shouldn't be any kind of ecological impact because we are just replacing the species that have gone extinct. But if we hybridize a northern white rhino with a southern white rhino, right, the genotype is different, the phenotype might be slightly different, and we don't really know what the effects are.
Okay.
So I'm more cautious about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so if someone did want to go into this field of conservation and do this sort of work, what kind of path would they need to take?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So personally, I had an undergraduate degree in biological sciences, and then I did my master's in biological sciences, and then after my master's, I did a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. So to be a conservationist, or there are many paths, or there are many conservation-related jobs. If a person wants to do on-the-ground conservation, then I would say it would be great to do a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in ecology or conservation ecology or environmental management or wildlife management, and this person will be able to get like a good field-based job in conservation. But if a person wants to do research or lead research in conservation, then this person will almost certainly have to do a PhD first. Okay. And often it would mean that this person will also have to do a postdoctoral fellowship or be in a job before they can become competitive to be a professor. But again, there's a broad range of jobs, right? Like you can do research at a university, or you can do research in a zoo. But most of the time, in order to lead research, you would have to typically get a PhD and get some research experience. Okay,
so more of like the hands-on sort of conservation work. That's are people still encouraged to go get their bachelor's degree for that as well?
Oh yeah, for sure. To do hands-on work, yeah. A really good friend of mine, Ruben Clemens, does a lot of hands-on conservation work in Malaysia, trying to conserve tigers by ensuring that there are patrol teams patrolling the edges of forests to prevent poachers from coming in to poach the tigers or trap the tigers. And he has a PhD from James Cook University, and he published a lot of work and is still currently publishing work. So even doing hands-on research, it might be good to get at least a master's or a PhD so that you can understand the intricacies of conservation and the ecology behind conservation. Okay,
all right. And so I think that's all the questions I had. Would you be all right to talk a little bit more about your research, if that's okay with you?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so could you just go ahead and sort of like reintroduce kind of like your research again? I know you did that at the very beginning, but we're going to use this as kind of like a transition in the podcast. So could you just tell me a little bit more about the research work that you do?
Yeah. So right now, so I just joined UT last year, and I've set up several projects. Like one of them is a collaborative project between myself and my postdoc Matt Troyer, and Matt is leading this project. What we're doing here is that we're trying to figure out what is the impact of climate change, or the likely impact of climate change on fish species that are occurring in the southern Appalachians.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that in the next 50 or 100 years, climate is going to change in terms of like temperatures are probably going to warm up. So we have good model predictions of how air temperature and precipitation is going to change.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't really know how this change in air temperature might translate to a change in stream water temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did was that we put out 160 water temperature loggers all across the southern Appalachians in multiple river basins.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're doing is we are trying to track really fine scale every 50 minutes what is the water temperature like. So then we can set up a model linking air temperature at the present to water temperature at the present, and use this model to predict future water temperature given future air temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then at the same time, we are bringing fishes in the lab. So in fact, we have brought fishes in the lab and we've done the experiments. We are measuring what is the maximum temperature each fish species can tolerate.
Mm-hmm.
And from then, by combining the results of this experiment with our modeling results of stream water temperature, we can figure out how the distribution of the different species of fish would change in the future due to climate change.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of different working parts going in together.
Yeah.
So was there a specific reason why you wanted to go into this project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the most important reason is that we are very strategically located. So the southern Appalachian region is the hotspot of freshwater fish diversity in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you compare different watersheds across the world, southern Appalachian watersheds have a really high species richness. Just so it means that for a given amount of area, watersheds in the southern Appalachians harbor a lot more fish
Mm-hmm.
than on average other watersheds. So we are interested in seeing how climate change might impact fishes that are restricted to these watersheds.
Mm-hmm.
And also we know that in the southern Appalachians there's a broad altitudinal gradient, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there is lowlands all the way up to the mountains. And we know that lowlands are generally warmer, mountains are generally cooler.
Mm-hmm.
We know that climate change is going to make lowlands and mountains both warmer. So we are interested to see whether fishes are likely to move upstream, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we expect as the lowland streams get warmer, perhaps the fishes are unable to tolerate the new temperatures in the stream anymore, and therefore would have to move upwards to a cooler kind of habitat.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
So is there like a specific direction you're hoping this research is going to go in, or you're just kind of like still trying to see what you're going to get out of it?
Yeah, so we have just kind of analyzed our data and submitted our first paper for publication.
Mm-hmm.
So we're still waiting to hear back, because in science there's this peer review process where we have to write up a paper and then send it to a peer-reviewed journal, and the journal editor would then send out the paper to independent experts in
Mm-hmm.
other institutions or universities. So usually an editor would solicit reviews from anywhere from 2 to 4 reviewers, and then the reviewers would go through the study with a fine comb, suggest ways to improve it, and ultimately recommend whether the article should be accepted or should be revised or should be just rejected.
Mm-hmm.
So we are still in that process, the scientific process. Future plans would be, so right now we looked at 4 species of fish.
Mm-hmm.
Future plans would be kind of to expand that, and also look at non-lethal effects, like for instance how warming temperatures might affect not just survival but other characteristics, like would it affect the fecundity of the fish, for instance, or how well it assimilates food, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
That does sound really interesting. Was there anything else you wanted to add on to that, or?
Yeah, and recently we also have done a meta-analysis on coal mining impacts in southern Appalachians, and we find that coal mining is pretty bad for aquatic biodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it was actually a US wide study, but most of the studies that we found and reviewed were no, actually all of the studies that we found and reviewed in our paper was from the central and southern Appalachians region.
Mm-hmm.
So most of these studies dealt with mountaintop mining, all except for the one other study dealt with underground mining. But across all of these studies, on average, we found that streams that are affected by mining typically contain 1/3 lower species richness and about only half as much total abundance of biodiversity as streams that are not affected by mining.
Mm-hmm.
So we are finding like a really huge effect, and this research actually just got published not yesterday, the day before in the journal Nature Sustainability. So we're happy that came out. As for future plans, what we're trying to do is to look at mining impacts in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia. So Indonesia is the world's 5th largest producer of coal, and coal mining is literally under the radar there. Like it's an issue that hasn't received much attention, and we are interested to see how coal mining there are affecting human livelihoods, water quality, as well as stream biodiversity. So that's a new project that we're starting.
Yeah. And that really does like have a major effect on everybody. So even though you said like this project would be like located like centered around the coal mining industry in Indonesia, but the work that you will find from that research will impact everyone, not just people in Indonesia. And I think that's really awesome. Yeah, I didn't know that there was like a really huge coal mining industry in Indonesia. That's really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, definitely. Like even so even my friends who are working in Southeast Asia, working in Malaysia or Indonesia, looking at ecological issues, they have been mostly focused on agricultural issues rather than mineral extraction. So they were really surprised when I told them that mining is a big issue in Indonesia.
Yeah.
And it's just something that very few people know about. So last summer I actually partnered with an independent journalist who has done a lot of investigative reporting on coal mining in Indonesia, and we visited some of these areas to talk with villagers into how they are affected by coal mining, how coal mining has affected their kind of rice production or their livelihoods, and it's interesting.
Awesome. So that concludes this episode of the Ask a Scientist podcast. To quickly recap, we covered what conservation is and why it's important, reasons how a species can become endangered and even extinct, as well as the steps you can take to work in conservation efforts. We also talked a little bit about Xingli's research work and the apparently underground coal mining industry in Indonesia, which is really interesting. So I want to thank Xingli again for being our guest on this episode, and thank you for tuning in. So share this episode with a friend so they can learn something new, and check back for more episodes released bi-weekly.